Good morning, and thank you for attending another episode of the ClinEdge webinar series. My name is Simone, and I will be your moderator today for how to run a research program like a business, 7 techniques to grow your site. For those of you who are new to our webinar series, ClinEdge hosts webinars each month partnering with experts in the industry. We strive to cover various topics on clinical research, including but not limited to operations and optimization, patient recruitment and retention, financial services, technology, and more. We invite and encourage experts from all realms of the healthcare industry to present in our webinar series to help promote learning, idea exchange, and progress. Our mission is to spread inspiration for clinical professionals by clinical professionals. We really would like to hear from you and would like to include your voice in the conversation. So ask questions, share comments, even challenge our ideas. You can use the question and answer panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar sidebar to share at any time during the webinar. We will also have a few poll questions. Those will pop up right on your screen, but more about those later. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Scott Palmisi. Scott is Vice President of Site Network at BTC Network and has been in the research industry for close to 10 years. As a member of the leadership team at BTC, Scott oversees the daily operations of the company and provides guidance for the development of new processes and initiatives. Scott specializes in site operations, including business development, financial management, and patient recruitment and engagement. So once again, if you have any questions during the presentation, please submit your questions at in the box in the right side panel of your screen. There will be about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a question and answer session. I'll be asking questions out loud at that time. Any questions not addressed may be answered in a follow-up blog post or answered directly by email. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Scott to begin.
Thanks, Simone. So today we're going to go over how to run your research program like a business. So as everybody probably knows that's on this call, running a research site is tough. We talk to a lot of sites that, tell me that they're starting a research site and, they ask me, how long does it take for a site to become profitable? They realize that there's so many different costs involved with sites, and it's hard to, bring in the studies and negotiate the budgets, and it's hard to, kind of get to that level that sites are looking for very early on. As I mentioned, well-paying studies are becoming harder to come by. Budget negotiations are becoming tougher. The studies are becoming more complicated. We talk to a lot of sites that say that the recruitment portion of studies, that they're able to get the studies, but it's hard to find those patients because the inclusion and exclusion criteria is becoming more and more limited on the studies each year. So all of these potential challenges were kind of what led us to put this webinar together. So in this webinar, we're going to discuss 7 areas and provide strategies for each. So all of these areas that we're going to talk about, we could definitely do an entire webinar on each one, but we're going to kind of go through at a high level some strategies that we think would be helpful in order to address some of these different challenges. And then, of course, any questions that you have, I can answer at the end. So of these different areas are determining the best trials for your organization, patient population, assessing your staff's workload to ensure capacity and identify staffing needs for planned growth, developing and negotiating study contracts and budgets to ensure a positive financial picture, accurately handling invoicing, collections, and payments, as well as to prepare study financial statements, what the right clinical trial management software looks like, the right metrics to get an accurate picture of site performance, and then finally we're going to review quickly at the end how to implement proactive and not reactive patient recruitment strategies. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to determine the best studies. So sites often ask me, how do I break into studies that I have a patient population for, but I've never done it before, or I get asked, I haven't done any studies before, but the only studies that I'm seeing are challenging studies, patients that are really hard to find. So should I take them? And every site situation is different. So when you are looking at a potential study, let's say that you get through the feasibility phase, you're awarded the study, and you're at the budget phase, and you decide, is this worth it to take? So, of course, first and foremost, do you have the patients? One of the things that sites fail to realize typically when they start out is that reputation is everything with sponsors and CROs. So if you have a patient population for a study and you don't think that you can access it based on your other resources, your referral sources, your advertising techniques, typically it's not a good idea to take the study. If it is something that you, on the other hand, may be able to access based on other resources that you have, it might be something to consider. Sometimes sites will close themselves out of studies that, based on their relationships with other physicians and advertising techniques, that they may be able to access. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. Of course, probably most obviously on here, historical metrics and performance. If you have historical metrics on, on a certain indication, you can perform really well, it might be a study you want to take. Even if you're kind of a mid-sized site and you are looking at a study that maybe isn't the best budget, but maybe the budget's okay, but based on your prior performance of that indication, you can knock that study out of the park, you can randomize all the patients very quickly. It might be something that's worth taking if it's something that you can handle very easily. Similarly, I know that we do a lot of CNS studies. So one example that we see a lot of times is sites that work on Alzheimer's studies. So if you're working on an Alzheimer's study and you have a mild study and then you have a moderate study and the inclusion criteria is very close between the two studies, knowing what other studies you have and knowing that, if a patient doesn't qualify for one, that they might be able to slot into another, that might also be something to keep in mind. Because of course, if you have a patient come in for screening and you're able to fit them into something, that obviously revenue for the site, and of course, something you can do to help the patients as they're coming in looking for potential treatment options. Of course, an opportunity to prove yourself, so working with a new sponsor, CRO, and this kind of goes along with what I mentioned previously about new sites too. So a lot of times new sites will tell me, as I mentioned, that it's tough to get competitive studies, that the only studies that they're being offered are tough studies. Similarly, if you're working with a new sponsor CRO, if they've never worked with you before, maybe they're only offering you those tough studies. And a lot of times I advise sites in those situations to take those studies rather than pass on them. Because if you show that you can do well at a tough study, it's going to be much easier for you to get those competitive studies. Oftentimes we see that once you are able to randomize those couple of patients in that rough, stringent criteria study, the same sponsor will come back and say, hey, you know what else I have? You guys might be able to do this. And if they know that you put the resources and the time in place in order to do the tough study, they know that you're going to have no problem with the easy study. Knowing physician staff interests. So of course, having a physician engaged in the research is going to be important. So making sure that the staff is excited about the study, that everybody's kind of on board. That's definitely important. Financial justification is important, of course. If you're a large site that's running 30 different studies, you've got several coordinators, extended resources, maybe taking that low-budget observational study isn't necessarily worth it financially. And of course, alluded to before, if the treatment device fits well with other studies or treatments, and you can potentially slot patients in based on other studies that they're coming in for screening, that might be a good way to look at it as well. So next we're going to go over a little bit on staffing. So another question that we often get from sites is, when is it time to hire another coordinator? Especially when we have sites that come to us that maybe only have one or two coordinators, they work with us, we're able to, help with the business development. They are, doing business development on their own, they're growing, and they say, well, when is it a good time to bring on new staff? So there's a few different things that we always tell them to think about. So of course, incoming volume is the most obvious. Obviously, if you've got several studies that are coming in, you know that the volume is going to grow. It might be time to hire a new staff member. But it's important to take a look at that volume. So one of the points that I have on this slide is visit capacity. So we have some sites that ask me, well, how many visits should a coordinator do? How many visits makes a coordinator kind of worth their cost to the site? And I've gotten different responses. Some people say 10, some people say 15, some people say less. But one of the things to keep in mind is that not all visits are created equal. As everybody on this call probably knows, sometimes you've got, studies where there's visits that are, 3 hours long, 4 hours long. A lot of those CNS studies, like the ones that I referred to previously, with all the rating scales, and if you don't have an extended staff, Investigator is and those visits are going to take some time. Of course, we also have studies where there's a lot of phone visits, visits that might take, say, 15 minutes. Of course, a coordinator can handle a lot more when it comes to that. So one thing to just keep in mind is what that visit capacity looks like, and that not all visits are created equal. And then coordinator responsibilities. So we work with a lot of sites where the coordinator just sees the patients. They handle the patients that they handle the visits, everything that the physician can't do. They handle the, some of the testing, the questions that we need to get, the answers from the data collection from the patients. But do they also do recruitment? We work with sites where the coordinator is also the one on the phone getting the patients to come in for screening. Do they do any pre-screening? Do they do the regulatory submissions? How much of the source creation are they involved in? So keeping that in mind as far as how much administrative work the coordinators are doing in addition to the patient visits is also important when determining whether or not to hire a new coordinator. Another important piece of the site, of course, is the investigator. So, making sure that the physicians are engaged is definitely important. Making sure that we, know how to motivate the physicians and getting them the more motivated that the physicians are, the more that they're going to get involved and the more that they're going to be excited about the research that they're doing. So every physician is motivated by something different. Physicians that are motivated just by the studies, the science of it, the potential for patient care. We get physicians that are motivated by the actual procedural aspects. They love actually doing the different procedures for the study. Then we have physicians that are, motivated by the financial structures as well. And so getting that, getting that idea and knowing what the physicians are motivated by is going to allow you to have physicians that are going to be more interested in taking more on. I won't go into it in too much detail in this webinar, but one thing that's important when it comes to paying the physicians is, how you structure those payments. So we work with sites that utilize all these different strategies, but of course you can pay a physician hourly. Typically for larger sites with larger volume, where you have patients coming in and out the door every day, all week, it may be worth having a full-time or part-time physician that is, going to be engaged and, working on patient visits for the duration of the study. We also work with a lot of sites where they pay physicians by procedure. So it depends on what procedures the physician is actually a part of. What we found is this is actually good for physician engagement because if you, let's say even for a sub-investigator, if you bring a sub-investigator on, sub-investigator wants to be involved in the study, you tell them, well, we're going to pay you by procedure. Any procedure that you conduct as part of the visit, we're going to pay you that, that cost that we have allocated into the budget. And a lot of times that, makes the physician want to do more of those and want to get more involved. We also, and this typically is for, we've seen for larger sites, but we also have seen sites go with a percentage model where we go by study, and each study they say that the physician is going to get a certain percentage of the full total budget. Of course, the drawback with that model is, kind of the opposite of what I mentioned for the procedural model. With the percentage model, if they're guaranteed a certain percentage for the study, they may be less engaged. But of course, every physician is different. Those physicians that are most excited by the science of it and the conduct of it may be able to work off of a percentage model. Another point that I have here is when to bring on a sub-investigator. So, of course, breaking into new therapeutic areas, a lot of times it's great to bring in somebody from a different therapeutic area and an area you may want to break into based on your patient population. So one thing that's important is getting the sub-I involved in all of your current studies to make sure that they have, when you're talking to sponsors, that they have that rapport with your site, that the sponsors realize that they've that they're a part of the site, that they are helping out with studies when they're able to. And then, of course, volume of work. So, as sites continue to grow, bringing in a sub-investigator, even part-time, can, allow them to, allow the site to take on a bigger capacity. And, of course, sub-investigators, as sites grow, if they're working with the principal investigators on a regular basis, oftentimes sub-investigators end up being the best principal investigators, since they know the site, they know the operations, and ultimately they'll start getting to know the patients as well. Another thing that we often get asked is when it's important to bring on other staff. So I have a few listed here: patient enrollment specialists, so actual staff that's dedicated to patient recruitment, regulatory staff, source creation staff, administrative assistants, EDC staff. So we've worked with sites that actually parse out all of these different departments within the site. Of course, the site has to be, definitely a bit on the larger side in order to be able to support this. But it is important to realize, as the as the study volume grows and as you get the capacity to see more patients, you want to make sure that the coordinators are, coordinating, are seeing patients, the physicians are engaged with the patients. So a lot of the administrative work that goes along with the study, so regulatory, source creation, EDC input, a lot of times as sites get bigger, they decide that it might be worthwhile to have have dedicated staff in order to do that. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on the actual budget and contract negotiation process. So again, this is something we could go into a lot more detail on, so I'm just going to give a high-level overview, hopefully provide some strategies for everybody to take back on their next budget or contract. So general tips that we typically give to sites: always obtain the full study protocol. We work with sites sometimes where they start negotiating the budget and they haven't seen the full time and event schedule. They haven't seen what all the procedures look like. And we always say that that's definitely leaving money on the table. The way that we negotiate budgets and contracts, we want to make sure that we're negotiating at a procedural level. So anything that's going to cause, that's going to take staff time or resources should be priced up in the budget. And in order to know exactly what's going to be needed for the study, you need the full protocol. Clarify the use of vendors and supplier reimbursement. So making sure as you're doing the negotiation, are the lab supplies being supplied? Is there a central lab? Are you sending the samples in somewhere centrally so you don't have to do the lab work, or at least all of the lab work? Any needed equipment. So we work with sites where they say, well, I don't have a certain piece of equipment. Maybe this isn't a good study for me. We always say, do the research, see if that equipment is easy to come by, and if so, maybe get the sponsor to pay for it. A lot of times we see, depending on what the equipment is, depending on how easily accessible it is, sponsors may pay for that sort of thing. Relationship building is crucial. So with our sites, we always tell them, you need to get back on budget offers and contract negotiations within 24 or within 48 to 72 hours. Sites that take weeks and weeks and months to negotiate contracts, where it's sitting in the site's court and not the sponsor's court, it definitely hurts you when it comes to those negotiations. And probably most importantly on here, thinking big picture and not putting too much importance on one line item. So we have a lot of sites where they say, hey, the investigator fee is too low, and we'll be working with them on a negotiation, and they say that investigator fee has to be here, and we've negotiated all the other aspects, all the other procedures, all of the other pass-through items up as high as we possibly can, and we've gotten a large percentage increase, and they say, well, I need that investigator fee up. What we always tell sites like that is to say, you can always, when you get the funds in from the sponsor, you can allocate as needed. But if we're able to get the overall budget up between the grant payments and the other pass-through items, that is often more important than one particular line item. And a lot of times in negotiations, when we're negotiating with our sites, we have a list of 20 different pass-through items that we will put into our negotiations. That we say these are different costs of the site, based on time and staff resources. And as soon as a sponsor says, no, we don't want to go with this, we're not going to approve this cost, then we say, okay, we won't approve that, but then we'll put some more somewhere else. And so that overall, we end up getting the budget that we need in order to make sure that the site is successful. So speaking of those pass-through items, I put a list here of a lot of the pass-through items that we recommend that sites take a look at. So everything here from startup fees, non-refundable, and refundable. A lot of times we try to get an advance payment, especially because of all of the, for a new site, especially with cash flow issues up front, if we can get an advance payment for a patient or two, or a completed patient or two with a refundable startup, we try to do that. But everything from your standard pharmacy fees and archiving fees to contingency fees like, reconsent fees or protocol amendment fees or unscheduled visit fees, monitor change fees. All these things are important to try to get into that budget up front to make sure that, that we are maximizing the financial potential of each study. Another point that I wanted to hit on, screen failures. So a lot of times we talk to sites about how they should budget for screen failures. So, of course, we always say, the most important, the first priority is to try to get the total amount of all the screen failures. With a site with a low screen fail ratio, that may be, a possibility based on your relationship and based on, how you've negotiated thus far. But then, of course, there's ratios, so trying to get, so many screen fails paid out based on the number of randomizations, and then a cap. A lot of times we try to avoid the cap, of course, based on not knowing what's going to happen with the study, if protocol amendments happen. Of course, if there's a protocol amendment, you may be able to renegotiate, but, it's always good to get the most favorable terms up front. The other thing that's important to do is to try to get paid for each procedure that's done. If they kind of balk at paying for the total amount of the screen fail visit, trying to make sure that you are paid for every procedure done is important, because if you are not paid for every procedure done, of course you would end up losing money. Overhead, so when you talk about overhead, think about all of the different staff, resources, and time that's necessary. So one thing that sites, when we talk to them about this sort of topic, that sometimes don't think about is the actual time that's put in by the staff. So of course you have the cost of the procedures and the cost of salaries and everything like that. But the actual resources that you're pulling away from other things, there's a cost associated with that. So, including that in your overhead justifications when you're talking to sponsors can be important. Always pulling out diagnostic tests. We found that to be a good strategy to pull those diagnostic tests, put them in as pass-throughs rather than in the per-patient budget. And again, including everything that uses staff resources and time is very important. So this topic kind of goes along with the budget and contract negotiations, but it's almost, I would say more important to manage your receivables effectively. It's important for allowing an overall financial snapshot of your study and of all of your studies. And without managing your receivables, it's really tough to, really determine the health of your site financially, as you're bringing in these studies. As we talked about at the beginning of the webinar, trying to decide what studies are worth it for sites to take. It's tough to even to know that, after the fact, if it was worth it, if you're not managing your receivables effectively. So there's a lot on this slide, but I'll go through it briefly. Tracking receivables we'll talk about in a couple of slides, but either a CTMS platform, Excel can be used. We've seen sites utilize Excel and Google Documents effectively. Different CTMS platforms have this functionality built in already. All visit amounts should be tracked, totaled for all subjects seen. It's very important to do this along the way. We work with sites sometimes where they say that they kind of do all this, tracking at the back end. They'll finish a study and then they'll try to, figure out how much they should have made on the study. And a lot of times they'll find out that the sponsors may have messed up, or, they didn't reconcile appropriately when they got grant payments along the way. And it's very tough to correct those missteps at the end of the study. So it's important to do this along the way. Screen fail reimbursement, another thing that should be tracked, along the way. Pass-through expenses. So every invoiceable cost that you send over to sites, making sure that you're tracking those invoices when you're sending them out, when the sponsors say that they're going to pay, when you guys receive the funds. It's very important to make sure that you handle those invoices along the way. That's another area where I've talked to sites in the past, and they say that their process is that they do all of their invoices at the end of the study, and then they're having to find and track down receipts and other expense proof of expenses. And a lot of times they can't find them, and so being able to track all those invoices along the way is very important. Communication between finance and the coordinators is critical. So finance needs to be aware of the visits that the coordinators are performing, knowing when those unscheduled visits happen, knowing when the screen fails are happening, so that finance can reconcile appropriately. And of course, study closeout invoices, holdback amounts, very important to track all of that along the way. Following up with the CRO and sponsor on a monthly basis. So this is another area where sites sometimes don't realize that they're able to do this. As everybody on this call probably knows, sponsors and CROs are not always on time when it comes to payments. But our process with our sites is that we make sure that every single month we're following up to know when those next grant payments are coming in. In our contract, it says we're expecting monthly payments. So it's been 3.5 weeks, and so we want to know if we're going to get the payment this week. And that's the sponsor's responsibility, and that's their job. So never feel bad about doing that follow-up on a monthly basis to make sure that you are receiving the funds that you've earned through the study. And again, reconciling all payments. Mistakes are made by every sponsor, every CRO. Make sure that you're reconciling payments to ensure that nothing is missed. Another area that we've talked to sites a lot about is how to track receivables. So there's two major ways to track receivables from a financial perspective. So there's a cash basis essentially means that you're tracking your receivables by the money that is coming in. So once the funds are sent over to the site, each month they would have a tracking, however they're tracking their finances, and they would see, okay, I made $50,000 this month, I made $60,000 next month, and so on and so forth. An accrual basis is based on money earned. So as everybody knows, you complete a visit, but you may not get paid for that visit from the sponsor for another 2 months, another 3 months sometimes. When it comes to the invoices that you send out, it may take several weeks for the sponsors to pay back. So accrual is based on the money that is actually earned, not the money that is actually recognized in that month. So there's some pros and cons to both. So if you're doing your receivables based on a cash basis, you always know how much is in your bank account. You're never going to have any issues with that. But if you're managing based on an accrual basis, and oftentimes we ask, we advise sites to switch to an accrual basis if they can, because that gives you a better kind of day-to-day picture of what the performance of your staff is like. So knowing, how many visits did that coordinator do that month, and what was the, what were the fees that we know that we're earning from those visits based on the completed procedures. So you can see exactly how well you did in one month rather than knowing, looking at the cash from the work that you did 3 months ago. One problem with looking at it from a cash basis is you may not recognize when the site is not healthy. If those visits are decreasing, but you're earning all of the money, or you're receiving all of the money from the procedures and the money that was earned from 3 months ago, you may be in for a surprise the next month when your cash flow goes down, but your accrual revenue has been low the last couple of months. So I also wanted to show you guys an idea of what some of these reports look like when you're tracking your receivables. So this comes from a CTMS platform, and this is from kind of a sample made-up site, so this isn't real data. But what you can see here is CTMS platforms have the capability to run reports that will give you kind of the earned accrued revenue for each study that you're working on. So you can see here this hypothetical site is working on about a dozen studies or so. You can see therapeutic area, and this is all done on an accrual basis. So you can see how much was earned. There's other reports that will show you the cash that's coming in, but this is showing you kind of an overall picture. Now, with CTMS platforms and platforms like this, you'll also be able to delve into each study, look at each visit to see how much is earned per visit. You can break it down by staff to see how much is going to be earned from the coordinator's work, how much is earned by the physician, what the expense to the physician is. All of that can be tracked in platforms like this. You can see here, here is your receivables aging. So you can see with, again, another kind of sample site here. You can see earned revenue, and then you can see what's been received. So then you know what's outstanding, what you need to follow up on. There's other reports where you can see, break it down by 30 days past due, 60 days past due, and so on. You can also break into each study as well. So if anybody has any questions about some of these reports and what types of reports would be helpful, that's definitely something that we can discuss after the webinar. So speaking of clinical trial management systems, I have a poll here. Simone, if you want to pull it up.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys should see it up on your screen. And we'll leave it open for about 20 to 25 seconds.
Okay. So here I want to just kind of get an idea of how many of you guys utilize a CTMS system, how many of you guys are using Excel, and just to kind of see how familiar you guys are with these types of systems.
Yep, we'll wait just a few more seconds for a few more votes. Okay. Like they're coming in slower now. Can I close the poll?
Yeah, I think we should be good.
Okay.
Great. So it looks like we have a good amount of sites that are utilizing a few CTMS systems. And let me see here. Simone, it's coming up kind of small on my screen. Can you see which one people are selecting most often?
Looks like the highest percentage went to we aren't currently using a CTMS system. And then real-time and clinical conductor are pretty much tied.
Okay, great. So CTMS. So to give you guys an idea of what CTMS is used for those of you that don't currently utilize a CTMS system. So a CTMS system houses your patient database. So I don't know, for those of you that don't utilize a CTMS system, if you're utilizing EMR, if you're utilizing paper charts, CTMS can house all of that information and allow you to search and filter across those patients when you're doing doing your patient recruitment. Easily reporting your financials. So I've already kind of given you a snapshot of what one of those reports looks like, but there's several other reports that are helpful for sites, and all of that is connected to the patient visits, coordinator, investigator schedules. So when a visit is done by a study team, they can go in, complete the visit. They can mark which staff members completed which parts of the visit, and then you can track that and connect that to your financials. Most CTMS systems also will allow you to hide different information from different staff members. So if you are a coordinator and the site owner does not want you to see financial information, the coordinator will put in the procedures that were completed, the visits that were completed, but only the site owner will see the financials. The coordinator wouldn't see the financials. Then you can also track success of patient recruitment campaigns. You can connect these patient recruitment campaigns to each of the studies, and you can see which patient leads are coming from the recruitment different tactics. You can see which patients are being screened or being slotted into different studies. So it's, really I kind of refer to it as the home page for a clinical research site. I know the research site that I worked at last, we would come in, the first thing we would do is we would log into our CTMS system, and then the entire day, everything we would do would be logged into the system. So it's a really great tool to centralize a lot of aspects of the research process. So if you are looking at a CTMS, how to know which CTMS is the best. So different sites have different preferences. You should pick the system that fits your site. Certain CTMS systems have kind of more bells and whistles, more, kind of other features, kind of quality of life features. Others are more simple. Others have an easier time integrating with EMR. If we have any kind of academic or hospital type sites that are on the line, I know that connecting with EMR is often a challenge. There are CTMS systems that have that capability. Pricing models. So there's also systems that are priced very differently. So there's certain models where they're based on a flat rate. You sign a yearly contract and you pay that amount per year and then renegotiate each year. There's also CTMS platforms where they change the rate based on the number of active studies each month. So if you're a small site and you think, oh, well, CTMS sounds great, but it may not be something that I can, that I can afford right now. Of a lot of the tactics and strategies that we're talking about on this platform or on this webinar today, I think that looking and investing in a CTMS system is very important and is something for a growing site that is, worth a look and worth an investment. And there are CTMS platforms out there that will, decrease the cost substantially for a new site that maybe only has a couple of active studies. And reporting functionality. So as I've shown a couple of reports from a CTMS system here already, knowing what's important to each to your site management and what is important for you to track. Different CTMS systems are better at reporting functionalities than others. So definitely something to take a look at if you're kind of shopping around for a CTMS. So tracking the right metrics to get an accurate picture of site performance. So now that we're getting towards the end of the webinar, this is kind of your overall picture. So a lot of the different areas that we've talked about throughout this webinar, it's important to track the success of business development, of your staff, of your finances, patient recruitment, which we'll get into at the end. All of these different areas, it's important to kind of get an accurate picture on a month-to-month basis for how your site is doing. So what we utilize with our sites is what we call key performance indicators. So this should provide a comprehensive picture of the overall health of the site. I believe that, so we included a handout in the webinar. So if you take a look at that, I'm going to kind of briefly go over that so you can see what we're doing here. So this in the PowerPoint is a copy of what is in the handout on the webinar screen. So here you can see a sample site, so ClinEdge Research, a fake research institution, and you can see all of the different areas that we track on a month-to-month basis with sites. So the first section here is kind of your financial section. So looking at labor costs, how much are you bringing in versus how much, does your staff cost? Monthly revenues, month-end receivables. So pretty standard financials that most of you guys are probably tracking in one way or another. But then we break down all the other areas that we're talking about too. So we look at operations. We look at how many current site employees, how many studies are enrolling, what is the overall screen fail ratio. Now, of course, depending on the types of studies that you're doing, you may want to break this out actually by study because, of course, a tougher study may have a much higher screen fail ratio than an easier study, and so it may skew your data a little bit. Total number of patients coming in for pre-screening that aren't converting to a screening visit. So, if they are coming in, they're pre-screen passing, but they're not converting to a randomization, that's an area you can take a look at and say, okay, well, my pre-screening team, my people that are, kind of doing that initial phone screen are letting them come in for screens, but the percentage of those that are not qualifying for screening are not qualifying for randomization is pretty high. So taking a look at that number, trying to determine if there's any issues there on a regular basis is very important. Moving down the document that you guys have access to, looking at marketing. Now again, you can break this out by study, by tactic, but taking a look at the fees that are coming in by marketing, taking a look at the expenses, taking a look at the the patient screen randomized. And then looking at the pre-screening, looking to see how many of those patients that you're doing those phone screens are actually turning into randomizations. Business development, how many feasibilities are you submitting each month? How many PSVs, qualification visits? SIVs, how many studies are starting up? How many studies are you in negotiation for? And you can see here that we have it tracked on a month-by-month basis, so you can see the change over time and see based on, all of these factors, is the site in a good place, or, are there areas that we need to work on? And finally, this is just as important as everything else, but I want to kind of quickly go over proactive patient recruitment. So a lot of times we work with sites and they get their advertising budget on a study, and then they say, okay, now I've got this advertising budget, what am I going to do? We would argue that it's important to kind of get that thinking, that marketing, advertising thinking, going, before even you get to that point. So we've kind of identified some internal strategies and external strategies. So it's very important for sites to build a brand, to make sure that they are, kind of known in the community. And here you can see kind of an example site. But to know that that the patients know who you are, that they know that you're a trusted source for patient care, and that they are kind of getting over any stigma that the research industry might have. But getting a good website, getting a good brand, a good logo, is very important to make sure that you are kind of that authority, that first in line in the community. Especially if you're in a big city where there's a lot of sites that are out there, you want to make sure that you're not seen as kind of a knockoff or another site compared to the other sites that maybe are more established in your area. And externally as well, leveraging your internal patient database, making sure that once you have that brand and once you have that community presence, that patients are constantly engaged and familiar with what your site is offering. So we advise, sending newsletters, texts about new studies that are coming in, calling patients, emailing patients, keeping them engaged with your site, so that they, we've talked to a lot of sites, and what a lot of sites tell us is that, for sites that have been out there for a long time, they see a lot of patients that will come in for a study, and then they'll come in for another study, and they'll come in for another study, and they love coming in, they love the coordinators that they work with, they love the physicians, and if you keep them engaged and keep them keep their knowledge up about the different studies that are happening at the site, you're always going to do well with patient recruitment, or better at patient recruitment. Another thing that I have here that I don't have here, as far as kind of some proactive strategies, one thing that sites also can do when it comes to studies that are coming in is to start their pre-screening process ahead of time. So not waiting till the SIV to start pre-screening patients to get patients interested, If you have, let's say, an asthma study coming in, and you know you have an extensive database of asthma patients, you just got awarded the study, you're in contract negotiation, you know the study's going to happen, start reaching out to patients and saying, hey, we've got these asthma studies that are coming up. We think that you'd be a good fit for it based on, our previous experience. And, start getting them excited, start getting screens on the books. And, once you have that SIV scheduled, once you, are activated for enrollment, you can hit the ground running with screening. And so we definitely advise being much more, proactive when it comes to your patient recruitment strategies. And, again, there's various external strategies you can utilize. I won't go into too much detail on this, but, making sure that you're developing a tailored marketing strategy for each individual study, each population that you're going after, even based on where you are geographically. We've found when we've done advertising with some of our sites that certain tactics with the same populations work really well in one city, but don't work very well in another city. And being able to recognize what works well for your site is very important. So after that, I'd like to open it up to any questions that we might have.
Yes, thank you, Scott, for your very informative presentation today. We did get a few questions, so I'll go ahead and ask them now. And they were entered throughout the presentation, so I'll try to read them in order. This one I think is about staffing. So it's how many studies should a coordinator handle who does everything at a small site, such as study startup, to close out regs, budgets, patient visits, recruitment, etc.
Awesome. Well, that's a good question. So again, it depends, and I know that's not an easy answer, but it depends on the types of studies you're doing. If you are a small site and you're doing a lot of very involved studies with a lot of visits, they probably can handle fewer studies. I know, as an example, comparison, we work with small sites that do Alzheimer's studies. A lot of times there's a lot of visits. The visits are long. There's a lot of source to go through, a lot of rating scales. Maybe if all you're doing are studies like that, the coordinator can probably handle less. But then we also work with sites that do maybe some tougher GI studies where it's a, let's say a UC study, a Crohn's study, where you're only looking for 2 patients over a year. So the day-to-day work for a coordinator is going to be much less because there's fewer visits, fewer patients, and so it's not going to be, kind of the same volume. So as I kind of talked about at the beginning of the presentation, it's important to note that not all visits are created equal. So if you're working on a study where, there's a lot of visits, there's a lot of long visits, I would say, go towards less. If you're working on a bunch of observational studies with very quick visits, or you're working on studies with very few patients, then I would say more. But it kind of gets to the point from a site management perspective, how long or how often do you want coordinators to be doing patient visits, and how much of their day do you want them to be spending on, the administrative aspects of the research process, and kind of finding that balance and figuring out what you want that balance to be would be important in determining if you need to hire a new coordinator or even some of the other support staff that I indicated earlier as well.
Okay, great. Question number 2. We are a sophisticated site with a CTMS including a cost accounting system. We refuse to accept CMS as guideline as it is based on survey averages. We ask for management, sponsor / CRO level to be involved. How common is it for sites to have good business cost data?
So, as far as, and I think, definitely follow up with me if I'm wrong afterwards, but I think what you're asking me is how often is it that sites can have access to kind of the cost data that sponsors are looking at, whether it's fair market value or, what kind of that ballpark range is going to be. What we do is we've kind of, over the years as we've negotiated budgets, we've developed kind of an average, you can call it fair market value, but, obviously we try to make sure that the staff time in addition to the actual procedural costs is covered. But what we've done is we've kind of put together a, kind of a cost structure where we see kind of what is the low end of what we typically see, what is the high end. When you're doing your budget negotiations, we always say to start high so that you can kind of end where you want. One thing that I can do, if you want to follow up with me after the presentation, I can share some of that data with you as well, so you can see kind of some of the cost structures that we've seen through different therapeutic areas and what's been acceptable to sponsors and CROs.
Okay, great. Question number 3. We are no longer accepting holdbacks as it is an archaic tradition used in the paper-based data collection era. Rolling soft blocks over the course of trials negates the need for holdbacks. Oh, I think this is more a comment. We need sites to aggressively support the elimination of holdbacks. I'm not sure if you want to comment on that, Scott, or should I? You want me to?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's definitely interesting. I can't say that I've seen that before from another site. What we try to do when we're negotiating is we always try to go with no holdback. But we typically end up when we're negotiating at a lower holdback, maybe it's 5% or 10%. I know a lot of sponsors still like to keep it in there because they, it's kind of something they can hold over your head when it comes to, the closeout processes and making sure that everything is done the way that they need it to be done at the end of the day. So I haven't seen a lot of cases where we're seeing 0% holdback, but it is something we have seen a little bit. But that is interesting. It's not something that I've seen from a lot of sites at this point.
Okay, question I think this one's more about the platform. Great presentation for you, Scott. Where does one get the handout that Scott talked about? It should be on the control panel under handouts. There's an option for you to enter questions. It should be right next to that for those of you who weren't able to find the handout. Another question, average overhead percent? Question mark.
Yep, so average overhead percent, of course it depends on the size of your site. We typically try to end up in the 25 to 30% range for most studies. We have gone as high as 35% for tough, complicated studies that involve a lot of staff and resources, and also for kind of larger sites. But it depends on on your site and on the study to see kind of what's reasonable. But I would say anywhere in the 25% to 35% range is where we typically want to be.
Okay, perfect. Another question: what are some offline tactics that a study can use in a community or city where there's a good sized patient population for your study, but they are not responsive to online tactics, advertising, websites, etc.? More community involvement with local events? Question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good question, and I know I didn't go into too much detail on the recruitment aspect at the end, but yeah, exactly. I mean, more community events I think are great. For a lot of different indications. There's different. You have your Walk for Alzheimer's, and you have support groups that for different diseases. Especially for if you're looking at kind of a tougher indication where it may be tough to target those patients online, a lot of times, kind of reaching out to support groups would be an area where we've seen success. Referral sources as well. So this is something where everybody kind of has a different opinion as far as physician referral sources. What we found is, and this kind of goes back to physician engagement, making sure that the referral source is engaged in the study, is excited about the study, and maybe even is a sub-investigator or is involved in the conduct of the study, we found may allow referral source outreach to be a little bit more effective. But that's another offline tactic that we've seen be successful, but we've also seen that be unsuccessful. So it really depends on the relationships that you've built and how that relationship is set up for that to be successful. Of course, there's a bunch of traditional advertising methods as well. And again, it depends on the type of city that you're in. We've seen, big cities with, kind of a commuter population, a metro population. We've seen that, metro ads and newspapers have been a little bit more successful. Smaller cities where that's not as much of a part of the culture, we've seen that be less successful. We kind of see similar things with radio, where certain things are, certain cities we see success, other cities it doesn't seem to really be, a great way to reach patients. The other aspect, is just kind of to make sure that you are doing that proactive patient recruitment, as I mentioned at the end of the presentation. So making sure that you have kind of a good site brand, that you are in the community, and that you are engaging your patient database on a regular basis as well, is I think important in addition to the online tactics.
Okay, great. And I know we started just a few minutes late, so we will try to do one more. The question is, what do sites use if they do not have a CTMS system?
Another great question. So we've seen sites utilize Google Docs, Excel. I know that the site I actually started with used to track all of our business development in an Excel doc. So they would put, a spreadsheet with each study that we're following, the contact that we're talking to. Then they would have different spreadsheets for finance, where then they would, have a different tab for each study. They would be able to track the invoices. They would be able to track each of the visits, the amount earned per visit. Patient recruitment was done the same way, where they'd have spreadsheets basically for each study. Each tab would be a different tactic that they would utilize, and then they would, basically put in all of the patients that are brought in from those tactics, and then they'd be able to note pre-screen status, screen status, if they're randomized. So a CTMS system definitely centralizes a lot of those aspects, and it allows different pieces to tie to each other. But it is possible to do it in Excel. It is, there's many successful sites that do it, but it is, can be a little cumbersome when you're looking at a lot of different spreadsheets and tabs and everything. But it is definitely possible.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your questions. I have released a poll in case any questions weren't answered, or if there's anything you'd like to be followed up on presented today. But that is all the time we have for our webinar today, so look for our follow-up email, and we will alert you on the odds and yet status of today's event so that you can review any of these materials you missed or simply go over them again. Also, please take a moment to fill out our short exit survey. So on behalf of ClinEdge, thank you for joining us and taking the time to view our presentation. Have a great day.